Right, fetal blood and circulation. So again, just make sure we're about to get into a lot of details. I don't want you to overlook the big picture of what's going on here. So the point of the placenta, which is what we're about to look at, is that oxygen and nutrients are going to diffuse into the fetal blood from the maternal blood. So mom is going to pick up the oxygen with her lungs that she's breathing with and nutrients from the food that she eats. The fetus can't do either one of those things, so the mother's blood passes those on to the fetus. And then waste diffuses into the maternal blood from the fetal blood. The fetus doesn't have a way to get rid of the waste products because it can't urinate or defecate or exhale or anything like that. So those waste products are passed from the fetal blood to the mother. I meant to point this out earlier, but if you will notice, look at the picture on the bottom right, right here. Again, what this is showing us is that all of the purple on the outside is the mother's blood that is pooled into this area that we call the lacuna. And then those blood vessels, the small ones that branch out right here, that is from the fetus. Notice that the mother's blood and the fetal blood don't ever actually touch each other. That's important. The reason why that's important is the mother's blood has antibodies. And if you remember from the lymphatic system, antibodies are going to attack anything that doesn't belong in your body. Now, this fetus is the child of the mother, but it still has cells that are not the mother's cells, and it would attack the fetus's blood. Like the mother's blood would actually literally attack the fetus's blood and the fetus's body. So that's why we have to have a placenta that keeps those two bloods separate from each other. Vice versa, the fetal blood could attack the mother too. So that's why they don't ever actually mix or touch each other. What's going to happen is that the oxygen is going to build up. Oxygen is going to build up in the mother's blood right here. So in all of this purple right here, I've got a bunch of, I'm going to attempt to draw, that's a O2. That oxygen builds up in the mother's blood, and it's going to diffuse into the fetal blood. The reason that works is that the mother's blood has more oxygen than the fetal blood. And then all the waste on the inside right here is going to build up in the fetal blood, and it diffuses out into the mother's blood. All right, fetal circulation. I know you're all like, man, I missed the days when we had to talk about the pathway of blood and had those long, short answer questions. Good news, we have one more before the semester is over. So right now I'm just going to talk, like, in general, overview this. And then we will switch over, and I've got a pathway typed out for us already that we can kind of work through together. So it says the fetal blood has a greater oxygen carrying capacity than adult blood. So like when you were a fetus, you actually had a different type of hemoglobin than is found in adults, and it can carry a lot more oxygen. So the oxygen that's from the mom's blood that builds up in the placenta jumps over to the fetus blood really easily because that hemoglobin carries more oxygen. The umbilical vein carries oxygenated blood from the placenta to the fetus. So just remember, the kind of tricky thing about that is when we're talking about the umbilical vein, I typed that in red on purpose because vein just means that it's carrying the blood back to the fetus's heart. And you can notice, it's kind of small, but if you look at that picture on the right, there are arrows that are showing the blood is going back towards the heart. Okay, so it's a vein because it's carrying blood back to the heart. The tricky thing is that it's oxygenated, so it's going to look red. So just one more reminder that the fetal blood, the veins are red because they have oxygen, and then the arteries are going to be blue because they do not have oxygen. All right, so we're going back to the liver first. If we can kind of follow, we'll get more into this in our pathway, but follow the umbilical vein, making its way back. And when it gets right here, it says half of the blood goes to the liver. The other half of the blood goes to what we call the ductus venosus. It conducts the other half of the blood to the inferior vena cava, and it bypasses the liver. It's kind of hard to see right there, but what we're doing is we've made our way to the liver. Half of the blood is going to branch off and go to the liver on this side. The other half is going to shoot straight over to the ductus venosus. It might be easier to see this. And kind of trace the way back where that line is. So the ductus venosus That's that red branch right there that is taking blood straight to the inferior vena cava. So the point is we've got a split. Blood is coming back to the fetal heart through the umbilical vein, but then it splits. Half of it goes to the liver, the other half goes straight to the ductus venosus. Either way, though, it ends up merging in the inferior vena cava right here. All right? So I'm trying not to drag this out too much, but I know that out of what we're talking about today, this is probably the one that's a little trickier. So I'm going to pick green, and let's see if we can kind of follow. So we're starting here, umbilical vein, doing a loop through the umbilical cord, and then when I get right here, half of the blood is going to split and go into the liver. The other half is going to go into this, what's called the ductus venosus. But both of them end up merging back into the inferior vena cava, and we're going to go back to the heart. All right, so hopefully we remember from the cardiovascular system, the inferior vena cava dumps the blood into the right atrium. So that's where we're going once we get into the heart, is the right atrium. Now here's another difference, though. In the heart, we went from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and then we went to the lungs through the pulmonary trunk. These lungs are not breathing yet, obviously, because they're surrounded by amniotic fluid, so they're not breathing air. This is still fetal development before birth. So what happens is that some of the blood is going to bypass the pulmonary circuit. It's going to go from the right atrium. Now, usually you have a wall that separates your right atrium and left atrium. That was actually a structure that we named that was called your interatrial septum. During the fetal stage, though, there's actually a hole that joins those two sides. So the right atrium, the right top chamber, and the left atrium, the left top chamber, are actually connected to each other through a structure called the foramen ovale. So the foramen ovale conveys blood from the right atrium to the left atrium, and the lungs are bypassed. Jump up to the superior vena cava. It says some blood from the superior vena cava enters the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. Most of it bypasses the lungs, though. So again, it's not really important that the blood goes to the lungs yet, because those lungs aren't picking up oxygen. So not a lot of blood is going to be going through there. Definitely not all the blood, like happens when you're an adult. So when it bypasses the lungs, it goes through the ductus arteriosus, conducts the blood from the pulmonary trunk to the aorta, and the lungs are bypassed. All right. So what this is, I know that's a really small picture of the heart, but picture the pulmonary trunk goes up, and it would usually branch into the right and left pulmonary arteries. Instead, though, what happens is that the pulmonary trunk bumps up right next to the aorta, and the blood just gets bypassed, and it doesn't go to the lungs at all. It goes straight to the aorta. If you remember in the lab of your lab final structures, you had something called the ligamentum arteriosum. So what happens is that obviously when we are adults, we don't have that connection. There's not a hole in our heart from the right to the left side, and there is not a passageway from our pulmonary trunk to our aorta. Those are going to seal off completely by the time that we're born, and definitely into an adulthood. But what's left is this ligament. So right here, the ductus arteriosum that we talked about, once that closes off, that becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. So that's why that heart structure was something that we wanted to look at in lab, is because it has to do with fetal blood flow. All right? So the blood from the abdominal aorta, we've made our way to the heart. We passed to the right, from the right atrium to the left atrium through the foramen ovale. We went from the pulmonary trunk to the aortic arch through the ductus arteriosus, and now blood is leaving the heart again. So the blood from the abdominal aorta is going to branch into the umbilical arteries, which carries blood from the internal iliac arteries to the placenta, and there the blood is reoxygenated. So after the umbilical arteries, we go back to the placenta, we pick up our oxygen, and then the whole cycle starts again. Okay, it's a little tricky. I'm going to go back to my green ink, and hopefully we can see this. But what we are saying is blood, once it leaves, here's the aorta. So the blood leaves the aorta, goes back, so that's our ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, thoracic aorta, goes down to the abdominal aorta, but then it's going to split common iliac artery And then last one is internal iliac artery. That internal iliac artery is where the umbilical artery branches off of. So the umbilical, it's actually arteries because there's two of them. Those are the two blue blood vessels. They're going to spiral through the umbilical cord. They're going to make their way back to the placenta, and that's where they're going to dump off their waste and they're going to pick up more oxygen. Okay, so that's kind of a lot. Now, that's the good thing about these being recorded is if that was kind of confusing to you, feel free to pause that, rewind it, go back until it kind of makes sense. But what I think is going to help is I have notes typed up for the pathway of blood. So feel free, when I pull this up, feel free to pause it. Let me shift my screen a little bit. There you go. I think you can see that now. So feel free to pause it and copy that after we go through it. And this is something I would expect to see probably as a short answer question on that last test. So fetal blood flow. We're just going to start off saying maternal blood. So blood is coming from the mother and it goes into the placenta. That's where it pools. We called it the lacuna, but we're just going to clump that together and call it the placenta. So blood comes from the mom to the placenta. The nutrients from that blood, this is a little tricky, like this is a way oversimplified version of saying this, but remember the blood doesn't ever actually mix between the two. That blood is going to pool up in the placenta. From the placenta, the oxygen and the nutrients are going to diffuse into the umbilical vein. If you wanted to add a note, just to make sure that doesn't confuse you, you could like draw a big star right above this arrow right here, and you can say diffuses from placenta to the umbilical vein. So the blood doesn't ever actually mix, but the nutrients diffuse from the placenta to the umbilical vein. All right. From the umbilical vein, we go back, and this is where we had our first split. So half of the blood is going to go to the liver, and the other half of the blood is going to go from the, ductus venosus. So that's our first big split we've got. Half the blood goes to the liver, half of the blood goes to the ductus venosus. But once they split, they're going to meet right back, and the blood is going to go to the inferior vena cava. Okay? From the inferior vena cava, we go to the right atrium. I did some abbreviations, so RA is just going to stand for right atrium. And the right atrium splits again. Half of it, or some of it at least, is going to go to the foramen ovale, straight to the left atrium. Okay, that was that hole in between the two atria. Usually we have a septum there, but it goes from the right atrium through the foramen ovale to the left atrium and then down into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it jumps down to the next line to the aorta. Okay, so that's part of it goes right atrium to the foramen ovale. The other part goes from the right atrium, drops down into the right ventricle, like normal, and when it goes to the pulmonary trunk, it passes through that ductus arteriosus. That's the secret passageway that we have from getting to the pulmonary trunk, and then that branches to the aorta. The point behind that is that we are skipping the lungs. Those lungs aren't picking oxygen up for us right now, so we don't have to go to them. But right atrium, I can either go from the foramen ovale to the left atrium to the left ventricle to the aorta. That would be our normal way. If you'll notice, I'm skipping the valves, so feel free to not list those this time. We covered that enough last time, so you do not have to do that on the test, all right? Just name the chambers. So right atrium, foramen ovale, left atrium, left ventricle to the aorta, or right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary trunk, and then through the ductus arteriosus to the aorta. The aorta is the ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, thoracic aorta, and abdominal aorta. Then when we go down to the bottom near the pelvis, it splits into the common iliac artery, splits to the internal iliac artery, and then the umbilical artery. Okay? Umbilical artery, that is where the blood is going to go back to the placenta, and the whole cycle would start all over again. Okay? All right, so I know that's kind of detailed. Again, feel free to pause, rewatch, do whatever you need to do to get a hold of that. Also, send me a message if this isn't clicking for you. Send me a message on Blackboard. Don't wait until right before the test because I probably won't get it. But feel free to look at that. All right, that's the worst of it. We do have at least one or two more parts to go, but the rest of this is much simpler compared to this. So don't get discouraged and not quit watching these. All right.